roach-infested apartments, a painted wall warning that once read, "Do not eat the bugs," and a city that spent 20 years polishing itself into something almost unrecognizable. Welcome to the Rise the Limit. This is Chapter 6, Damp Detours in Savannah, Don't Eat Bugs, where a family road trip back to the narrator's old stomping grounds collides with king tides, closed beaches, and improvised aquarium visits, all while Savannah's layers of personal memory, Civil War history, and tourist-ready legend compete for the same square footage. From Fort Pulaski's crumbling masonry to the dubious Shanghaiing tunnels beneath the pirate's house, this one's a rain-soaked tour through what's real, what's remembered, and what's been gift-wrapped for visitors. Just as the sun began to properly bake the streets, I felt compelled to make a pilgrimage. The destination was not a battlefield or a stately home, but my old apartment, a place that taught me more about survival than any trustee-era policy on rum or Catholics. The neighborhood had experienced what urban planners call improvement, which usually means things have gotten expensive. An older Maserati gleamed nearby, a steel and glass testament to someone's success. I am fairly certain the monthly maintenance on a single one of those cars would have covered a year's rent on my old place, with enough left over for a lifetime supply of bug spray. I began telling my son about my grand adventures in that dingy one-bedroom. The roaches like to snuggle, I explained. My newly purchased air mattress had a hole. I gave up inflating it and slept on the hard floor for 9 months. One night I woke to the distinct bristly feeling of one against my abdomen. In a confused, half-asleep state of primal terror, I grabbed him. I threw him with such force that he was stunned upon impact with the far wall. It was a short, violent, and victorious battle. My son looked at me as if I'd just confessed to wrestling a bear. We had come to a small measure of peace, my 6-legged roommates and I, though a prime directive remained. Never enter the kitchen after dark and flip on the lights. It was like opening a forbidden tomb, except the treasure was a writhing floor of what locals politely call palmetto bugs. The apartment's finest feature was a piece of found art above the kitchen sink. A prior tenant had spelled out a message in 3-inch construction paper letters. The subsequent maintenance crew, in a display of apathy or avant-garde collaboration, had simply painted right over them. In the right light, a faint outline remained visible, an archaeological whisper from a lost civilization. The letters offered a simple, profound command: do not eat the bugs. It wasn't a suggestion, but a decree, born from an experience so specific and harrowing that it demanded immortalization. From one den of scuttling thieves, we proceeded to a more officially recognized establishment of scoundrels, the Pirate's House. This tavern, a sprawling complex of dark wood and low ceilings, claims to be the spot that inspired Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island. The local legend involves a system for involuntary naval recruitment. Unsuspecting sailors were plied with drink, knocked over the head, and dragged through a secret tunnel to the Savannah River. They would wake up with a world-class headache on a ship already at sea, having been impressed into service. It was an aggressive form of headhunting, a career fair from which there was no easy exit. Who doesn't love the idea of treasure? Robert Louis Stevenson certainly tapped into something with his famous island. The decision to believe is the primary transaction at the Pirate's House. You can choose the legend, or you can choose the less exciting and therefore less profitable facts. The house itself stands on what was once the Trustees' garden, an experimental plot from the 1730s. The colony's founders envisioned an economy built on fine textiles, an agricultural paradise. Instead, they got a port. Ports obtain sailors, and sailors require taverns where they can be separated from their money and, occasionally, their freedom. This is where the historians, the eternal party poopers of local tradition, step in. They point to dusty maps and brick analysis suggesting the oldest bits of the restaurant date to the 1790s, with most of the structure arriving in the mid-19th century. They note that the famous Shanghaiing tunnels, while real, served the decidedly less thrilling purpose of drainage. They dismiss tales of the fictional Captain Flint dying on the premises as, well, fictional. The restaurant's most treasured story, that Stevenson sat in these rooms soaking up pirate tales, suffers from a particular mechanical flaw. Treasure Island was already being published by 1881, and there is no solid evidence Stevenson ever visited Savannah before then. But a good story has a momentum that facts can rarely arrest, especially when that story is printed on a menu next to a plate of fried shrimp. The Pirate's House was relaunched as a themed restaurant in 1953, an early masterpiece of blending preservation with commercial storytelling. The legend says Captain Flint died here. The legend says Stevenson was inspired here. The legend sells stories by the pint. In a city built on the shifting sands between utopian plans and messy reality, that feels like the most authentic history of all. Colonial harvest, silk dreams, southern roots. Knowing that the Pirate's House is built on a legend is one thing, knowing it is built on a botanical graveyard is another. Every new thing which is done, wrote the botanist Joseph Banks, is ill done. It is a fine motto for anyone attempting to impose a grand design on a new continent, especially one where the primary exports are humidity and insects uninterested in formal work-for-hire agreements. This very spot, now a profitable emporium of fried seafood and questionable folklore, was once the bleeding edge of imperial science. It was the Trustees' garden, the first public agricultural experiment station in British America, and the cornerstone of a plan to engineer a new Eden. The idea, hatched by men in London who had presumably never been sweated on by a Georgia summer, was to turn the colony into a boutique supplier for the British Empire. They envisioned this plot as a research hub, a sort of subtropical Silicon Valley for plants that would free Britain from its dependence on foreign goods. The investment pillars were silk and wine, the 18th century equivalent of betting the farm on a volatile cryptocurrency. The Trustees launched their leafy startup in 1734, just east of Oglethorpe's primly gridded town, hoping to cultivate a prosperity as neat and orderly as the city's squares. The Silk Initiative was a masterpiece of misplaced optimism. It required white mulberry trees to feed a workforce of silkworms, implying a reliance on perhaps the most demanding and least cooperative immigrant population in the colony. Production was fussy, seasonal, and required the kind of careful, subsidized labor that the colony's ban on slavery made impossible. Still, they had their moment. In a brilliant piece of 1735 marketing, Queen Caroline wore a gown of Georgia silk to court, a public signal to investors that the colonial looms were open for business. One can only imagine the pressure on the silkworms, tiny arthropods carrying the weight of imperial economics on their invertebrate shoulders. In these descriptions of grand plans faltering, I felt a strange kinship with those long-dead trustees. Their high-minded botanical laboratory, where every leaf and root was designated to serve a glorious economic purpose, felt like a better-funded version of the "do not eat the bugs" decree in my old apartment. Both were desperate, slightly absurd attempts to impose order on a world that stubbornly refused to cooperate. The Trustees wanted to cultivate silk. My predecessor simply wanted to keep the ecosystem out of the pasta. Both mandates were destined to be painted over by time, one by a maintenance crew and the other by a tavern selling rum. While the silk experiment fizzled, a Jewish settler named Abraham de Lyon, who possessed actual knowledge of winemaking, managed to produce promising grapes nearby. His vineyard became a real-world testbed for the Trustees' ambitions, a brief shining moment when it seemed a decent vintage might emerge from the Georgia soil. But like the silk, it was not to be. The grand scheme came undone. Yet, in one of history's better jokes, the garden inadvertently helped spread two crops that would one day define the region's economy: upland cotton and the peach. The two things that made Georgia, Georgia were, it turns out, happy accidents. By the mid-1700s, the garden gave way to homes and, around 1753, an inn for sailors. The land's purpose shifted from cultivating silk to cultivating hangovers. A remnant of the silk project, the filature where the thread was reeled, stood for a time in Reynolds Square, eventually hosting a dinner for George Washington, a man who understood the pain of seeing a difficult venture through to the end. The Trustees project was a monument to central planning, a top-down system of absolute economic certainty designed to build a perfect society free from rum, slavery, and lawyers. Its rules were strict, its goals were noble, and its failure was total. But on the other hand, we did get peaches out of it. Scarlet and Steel, Savannah's unsung last stand. If the Trustees' garden was a monument to well-meaning failure, our next stop was a shrine to ruthless efficiency. We left the ghost of the silk colony and drove a short distance to the edge of the historic district, where the Savannah History Museum occupies the brick shell of the Central of Georgia Railroad roundhouse. I had braced myself for a dusty collection of rusty cannonballs and distressed wax figures. Instead, the building offered a lesson in the brute force of commerce. The exhibits focused less on revolutionaries and more on spreadsheets. Before the Civil War, this terminal was not merely a transit hub, it was the main artery of a global monopoly. Savannah functioned as a fire hose of money, blasting wealth into the Atlantic economy through the export of cotton. The museum made it clear that this empire of white fluff financed the city's delicate ironwork balconies and grand squares, all built on the backs of enslaved laborers. The fortune was amassed one bale at a time, a highly profitable model, provided you do not have to pay for the picking. This economic engine relied on stability, however, and the machinery jammed in April 1861. When President Lincoln announced the Union blockade, the money spigot turned off. In a surge of local bravado, Georgia militia seized Fort Pulaski, the massive brick fortification guarding the river mouth. Their confidence was absolute. They believed the fort's 8-foot-thick walls made it the 19th-century equivalent of a dragon-proof castle, capable of shrugging off any projectile the Union Navy could float downriver. Their optimism failed to account for the return of Robert E. Lee. Having helped design the fort's foundations years earlier as a young engineer, Lee returned to the coast not as a conquering hero, but as a deeply pessimistic building inspector. He surveyed the tactical map, particularly the exposed position of nearby Tybee Island, and effectively condemned the defensive plan. He ordered Tybee abandoned, a practical decision that also happened to be a strategic disaster. It was like handing an enemy the keys to the house and a map to the fuse box. The Union Army promptly occupied the island, gaining the perfect vantage point to lay siege. The gap between martial spirit and industrial reality was even starker in the story of the CSS Georgia. In a burst of civic initiative, the women of Georgia raised funds to construct a mighty ironclad to defend the river. Unfortunately, the Confederacy's industrial base could not match its fundraising. With proper armor plate unavailable, builders bolted railroad iron to the hull. Worse, the engines were so feeble that the vessel was less a warship than an asthmatic barge. The ironclad spent the war as a floating battery, its naval ambitions fatally checked by a powertrain that could not outrun a determined crab. It was a perfect monument to the South's predicament, a surplus of fighting spirit and a critical shortage of everything else. Lee's Folly, when brick met ballistics. Sometimes the story you get at a museum is just the appetizer. The Savannah History Museum had offered the Cliff's Notes version of Robert E. Lee's Coastal Defense Plan, a summary that painted the general as a confident tactician who simply miscalculated. But the diagram on the wall looked less like a strategy and more like a blueprint for wishful thinking, brilliant in theory, disastrous in practice. To understand why a tactical genius would hand the Union Army the keys to the city, you have to look past the grey beard of the 1860s and find the sweat-stained 22-year-old standing in the mud decades earlier. The tragedy's roots were tangled in the muck of the 1820s. Fresh from West Point in 1829, a young Second Lieutenant Lee was dispatched to the Georgia coast for one of his first major assignments with the Army Corps of Engineers, constructing a fort on the desolate, sodden patch known as Cockspur Island. He was known as the Marble Model, the cadet who had finished second in his class without a single demerit, a paragon of discipline dropped into a primordial swamp. His mission was Herculean. He had to tame the island's shifting soil and persuade it to support the crushing weight of a colossus. Surviving maps and sketches from this period show a man obsessed with drainage canals and embankments, waging a meticulously plotted war against physics, mosquitoes, and morale. He was learning on the job how to manage a mixed workforce of free men and enslaved laborers, but more importantly, he was learning to doubt the earth itself. Early surveys suggested the squishy ground might swallow the Masonry whole, a foundational lesson in the treachery of the Georgia coast. While Lee was making a name for himself in the marshes, the state already held a grim claim on his family. His father, the Revolutionary War hero Henry Light Horse Harry Lee III, had died on Cumberland Island in 1818 while returning from the West Indies. He passed away as a guest in the home of his old commander's daughter, far from his family in Virginia. Robert was only 11 at the time. It is a strange, detached piece of personal history, like finding a famous relative's name in the acknowledgements of a book you haven't read. The connection was physically distant, yet permanent. Lighthorse Harry's remains lay in Georgia soil for nearly a century before being moved to the family crypt in Lexington. That distant paternal footnote eventually intersected with Lee's own career. When he returned in 1861, now a Confederate general charged with defending the very coast he had helped fortify, the landscape was personal. I imagine him looking out at Fort Pulaski, the product of his youthful sweat and calculations, with a dangerous kind of parental pride. It was his work, solid and true. He knew the depth of those footings and the density of those 8-foot-thick walls. He believed them to be invincible because he had arguably performed a miracle to put them there in the first place. This conviction, a desire for his engineering to stand as a monument to permanence, created a fatal blind spot. He surveyed the tactical map and dismissed the threat from nearby Tybee Island, convinced that the marsh was too soft and the distance too great for the Union to drag heavy siege guns within range. In his mind, the mud that had fought him so hard in 1829 would surely fight the enemy in 1861. It was a comfortable assumption, and it led him to confirm the order that would doom the city: abandon Tybee. Stone walls, shifting sands, a siege's legacy. The museum exhibits frame this era with a certain tragic comedy. The Confederate High Command in 1861 had refined coastal defense into a science of defiant confidence, a strategy buttoned up and immaculate. Their faith in Masonry approached religious doctrine, with Lee, who knew Fort Pulaski's every brick from his own days laying them, serving as the high priest. Yet this conviction produced a strategic tidiness akin to leaving a key under the mat. The assumption that Tybee Island, sitting just across the water, was too isolated and marshy to matter. Union forces proved otherwise in November 1861, rowing ashore to occupy Tybee without firing a shot. Flag officer S.F. DuPont's gunboats secured the lighthouse, which stood like a giant stone surveyor's rod, a ready-made landmark for Union engineers to calculate their ranges. They had secured a forward operating base, proving that sometimes the most brilliant military maneuver is simply showing up to a place your opponent has decided isn't important. From this new beachfront headquarters, the Union soldiers gazed across the channel at the 19th century's idea of a superweapon. Fort Pulaski was a pentagonal behemoth, its brick walls nearly 8 feet thick. U.S. Chief of Military Engineers Joseph Totten had famously declared that one might as well bombard the Rocky Mountains, a statement custom-designed to tempt fate. The structure was a monument to a bygone era of warfare, built to withstand the smoothbore cannonballs of its day, which tended to bounce off regarding masonry like oversized spitwads. The Union response relied on a form of militant landscaping that Lee, for all his experience with Georgia mud, had deemed impossible. Throughout the winter, Captain Quincy A. Gilmore and his engineers turned Tybee's western shore into a line of artillery. It was miserable, mosquito-plagued work involving the Herculean transport of mortars and colossally heavy cannons through sand and swamp. They used rafts at high tide and sheer muscle at low tide, laying down corduroy roads over the muck, the very same shifting soil Lee had battled decades earlier. The difference this time was the ordnance. The Union arsenal included Parrott rifles and James rifled guns. Unlike the old smoothbores that lobbed a ball in a hopeful arc, these cannons possessed grooved barrels that sent conical shells spinning toward their targets. It was the technological equivalent of switching from a slingshot to a sniper rifle. Lee had prepared for a fistfight, unaware the opposition had brought industrial precision to the brawl. At dawn on April 10, 1862, the batteries opened fire. The effect was immediate. The pointed shells from the rifled cannons did not bounce. They drilled into the masonry. For 30 hours, the Union guns chipped away at the impregnable fortress with surgical violence. Once the rifled shells punched a hole clear through the wall, sending rounds dangerously close to the main powder magazine and its 40,000 pounds of black powder, the debate was over. Confederate Colonel Charles H. Olmsted faced a simple choice: surrender the fort or watch it satisfy the laws of thermodynamics. He ran up the white flag. The capture of Fort Pulaski slammed the door on Savannah as an international port, turning one of the Confederacy's economic engines into a defended but isolated backwater. The battle rendered every masonry fort in the world obsolete overnight. A humbling lesson that engineering permanence is an illusion. After the fall, the fort transitioned into a Union prison and a refuge for enslaved people seeking freedom. Union commanders, content with corking the bottle, looked at the Savannah River's sunken ships and underwater obstructions and decided not to push their luck. With the main channel thoroughly clogged, the city was left to wither behind its own defenses. Marching orders, a Christmas gift of Savannah. Bolting the front door, as the Union had done effectively at Fort Pulaski, improves security only until a 60,000-man houseguest decides to hike 300 miles and climb through the kitchen window. By late 1864, the war had ceased to be a distant naval blockade for Savannah. It appeared on the western horizon, dusty, famished, and famously short on patience. General William T. Sherman arrived at the city's periphery in December, ending his march across Georgia with a specific logistical need. He required a link to the U.S. Navy to resupply his army. Savannah remained a guarded but isolated knot of riverine defenses under Confederate Lieutenant General William J. Hardee. Sherman, contrasting the intricate masonry obsession of the early war with brute pragmatism, had no interest in untangling the knot. He looked for the loose thread and pulled. He targeted Fort McAllister, the earthen obstruction blocking the Ogeechee River supply route. On December 13th, Brigadier General William B. Hazen's division turned the assault into a 15-minute violent negotiation. The fort fell, the back door was kicked open, and the Federal supply ships began their approach. Inside the city, the calculus changed overnight. General Hardee, recognizing that a siege against a well-fed Union army was a mathematical impossibility, ordered a quiet exodus. On the night of December 20th, his garrison slipped across the Savannah River into South Carolina over a makeshift pontoon bridge. Mayor Richard D. Arnold, seeing no percentage in allowing his city to be used for artillery practice, rode out the next morning to offer a formal surrender. It was an act of profound civic pragmatism that saved Savannah's squares and Regency architecture from the incineration that had befallen Atlanta. On December 22nd, Sherman composed the telegram to President Lincoln that we now see reproduced in history books and museum corridors alike. He offered the city, along with 150 heavy guns and plenty of ammunition, and also about 25,000 bales of cotton, as a Christmas gift. The gesture was a masterstroke of public relations, the most grandiose Secret Santa exchange in American history. The cotton, a massive economic prize, largely belonged to local merchants like Charles Green, in whose Gothic Revival mansion Sherman established his headquarters. It was a precise, biting irony, the general sleeping in the guest room while the host's inventory became federal property. The occupation brought a quiet, inglorious end to the CSS Georgia. The ironclad, which we had studied earlier in the museum exhibits, funded by local women's societies but mechanically doomed by its own weight, was scuttled by Confederate sailors to prevent capture. Its engine groaned one last time as it surrendered to the river mud, confirming that the era of improvisational naval defense was over. Yet the arrival of Union forces prompted a shift far more radical than the transfer of cotton bales. In January 1865, Sherman and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton met in the captured city with 20 local black ministers. 4 days later, addressing a crowd at the Second African Baptist Church, Sherman issued Special Field Orders No. 15. This directive set aside a vast swath of coastal land for settlement by freed families in 40-acre plots. Although President Andrew Johnson would later reverse the order, the fall of Savannah momentarily did more than swap the flag above the Custom House. It redrew the map of freedom itself. Sea stories, from private passions to public peers. Perhaps as a counterpoint to General Sherman's dramatic entrance gift, our own exploration of Savannah continued on foot. A far less consequential campaign waged against tired legs and the city's bewildering supply of historical plaques. We passed the pristine, polished brass of a SCAD classroom building, noting how the art college seemed to have retouched the city's backdrop, before arriving at a handsome townhouse identified as the Ships of the Sea Maritime Museum. The name suggested a charming, dusty collection of tiny vessels sealed in bottles, the kind of painstaking work done by lonely lighthouse keepers on foggy nights. The reality was something else entirely. We had stumbled into what felt like a rich man's attic, provided his attic was a restored Regency mansion and his hobby was commissioning island-sized models. A staff member explained the origin story. A wealthy banker with a passion for maritime history and a distinct lack of shelf space had spent a fortune in the 80s and 90s commissioning these magnificent canoe-sized replicas. When his own home reached capacity, he did the only logical thing. He surrendered to the obsession, acquired the William Scarborough house, and converted it into the world's most elegant storage solution. It was not a random assembly of hulls and rigging. The banker had a fixation. The name Savannah appeared with such frequency that it felt less like a curatorial theme and more like an incantation. The city's name, we learned, has been painted onto the sterns of some of the most important and occasionally disastrous ships in American history. The first, the SS Savannah, was a local venture backed by merchants, including the man who built the very mansion we were standing in. In 1819, it became the first vessel to cross the Atlantic using steam power, a feat it managed for a grand total of about 80 hours. Although a technological marvel that hosted President James Monroe, the ship was a commercial failure. The heavy machinery cannibalized too much cargo space to be profitable. It was soon converted back to sail before unceremoniously wrecking off Long Island. A few steps away, a different century's ambition sat in miniature. Launched in 1959 under Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace program, the NS Savannah was the world's first nuclear-powered merchant ship. It was a sleek, futuristic vessel designed to prove that atomic energy could be benevolent, a goal it pursued by operating as a luxury passenger liner with terrible cargo efficiency. Currently a National Historic Landmark in Baltimore, it is slowly being decommissioned, though some locals still hope to tow it south, presumably to complete the city's collection of beautiful, financially perplexing boats. We had already encountered the name in its martial form via the World War II cruiser USS Savannah, but the litany continued through a Civil War steamer and a modern littoral combat ship. My head swam with a century and a half of naval triumphs and follies, a dizzying parade of steam, steel, and fission. It is a specific kind of obsession, one requiring both a deep reverence for maritime history and a bank account capable of floating a small navy. Yet after an hour spent among the silent fleets and the ghosts of bankrupt investors, the most vivid impression was not of a groundbreaking hybrid steamship or a Cold War public relations project. It was the impossibly green, quiet garden tucked away out back. A sudden burst of life that had nothing to do with ships at all. Real history, Savannah's cinematic layers unveiled. That quiet garden felt like a backstage respite, a pocket of reality tucked behind the main stage. Yet stepping back out onto the street, it became clear that a city this well-preserved does not just hold history, it rents it out. Savannah has established itself as Hollywood's favorite architectural character actor, willing to play any role that calls for high-style beauty and a faint scent of decay. The appeal is baked into the design. The Oglethorpe plan, with its grid of streets periodically blossoming into formal squares, accidentally created a series of perfect contained film studios. The live oaks, dripping with Spanish moss, frame these corridors in a way that is a cinematographer's dream, and a car washer's nightmare. This ready-made atmosphere, backed by generous state tax credits, effectively turned the historic district into a cheaper, more humid alternative to a Burbank backlot. Nowhere is the line between geography and screenplay blurrier than at Chippewa Square. This is the consecrated ground where Forrest Gump sat on a bench, waiting for the number 9 bus and dispensing chocolates and philosophy. The film's opening shot, a feather drifting past the steeples of the Independent Presbyterian Church and St. John's Episcopal, establishes the place with undeniable grace. The only problem is the bench itself. It was a fiberglass prop, a piece of deception placed there for the shoot and later hauled off to the Savannah History Museum like a holy relic. The actual spot where history was not made sits on the north side of the square, a patch of dirt now famous for its momentary association with a fictional man's posterior. While Gump imported its central prop, other productions relied on the city's bones. Clint Eastwood's Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil functioned almost as a documentary, filming in the Mercer House and the very squares where the bizarre true story unfolded. The roundhouse complex at the Railroad Museum stood in for the Civil War era in glory, and even the longest yard found a use for the topography, sending a car chase plummeting from the elevated Factor's Walk down to the chaotic cobblestones of River Street. The city's ability to shapeshift eventually drifted from historical drama into the surreal. When the live-action Lady and the Tramp needed a romantic backdrop for its spaghetti scene, a brick alley near Factor's Walk provided the necessary texture. More aggressively, the producers of the SpongeBob movie Sponge Out of Water decided downtown Savannah was insufficiently cartoonish. They descended upon Broughton Street and painted the storefronts a vibrating shade of coral to create the fictional town of Salty Shoals. For a few weeks, the mossy, tangled branches of the live oaks looked down on a fever dream of bright pastels. The peak of this cinematic intrusion arrived with the 2017 reboot of Baywatch. The production annexed nearby Tybee Island to play the fictional Emerald Bay, commandeering the pier for slow-motion heroics and motorcycle stunts. Downtown Savannah received a cameo during a chase through Forsyth Park, featuring Dwayne Johnson and Zac Efron looking deeply serious about their scooters. The region's geography proved versatile, with marsh channels doubling for high-speed jet ski lanes, but the community's patience had limits. After weeks of closures, noise and congestion, Tybee Island officials responded not with a request for a sequel, but with a revised film permit ordinance, proving that even the world's biggest action stars can still be brought to heel by the municipal code. Cobblestones, commerce, and commanders, Savannah's soul stroll. Even after a day spent cataloguing Savannah's cinematic doppelgangers, a question remains. What happens when the cameras stop rolling and the Georgia sky decides to quit playing a supporting role? After all the talk of movie magic, we found ourselves trudging down to the riverfront to experience the unvarnished, damp sock reality. We descended onto a section of promenade declared brand new in 2022, signaling the city's belief that if you just keep renovating, the river might forget it ever wanted to reclaim the land. Our first order of business was to acquire Gelato, a mission I pursued with the solemn focus of a naturalist hunting a rare species. I chose pistachio caramel, a combination so unexpectedly perfect it felt like a minor diplomatic achievement. Armed with our prize, we continued our soggy pilgrimage along the water. The weather was atmospheric, a polite shorthand for rain that had ceased to be a mood and become a physical assault. This walk offers more than wet shoes. It traces the city's original economic artery, a 2-mile stretch along the Savannah River that began as wharf lots sold off around 1798. The ground here is literally imported. The chunky granite cobblestones, known as Belgian blocks, arrived as ballast in the holds of empty ships, which unceremoniously dumped them on the shore like unwanted houseguests. Locals, spotting a free street in the making, paved the waterfront with the discarded weight of European vessels. Above these stones, carved directly into the bluff, lies Factor's Walk, a labyrinth of iron-railed bridges and stone ramps connecting the riverside warehouses to the grander Bay Street up top. Here, cotton factors, brokers, moved between storage and ship, their ledgers dictating the fortunes of a city built on agriculture and human bondage. Some of the brick warehouses, now peddling T-shirts and fudge, served historically as holding pens for enslaved people arriving from the Middle Passage, a grim footnote beneath the tourist-friendly gloss. The Riverwalk itself is a survivor. By the mid-20th century, the area was a derelict wreck, a collection of abandoned cotton warehouses surrendering to gravity and rot. A massive 1970s rehabilitation gave it new life as the John P. Rousakis Riverfront Plaza. This act of civic CPR was recently supplemented by the Plant Riverside District, a 1912 power plant reborn as a glittering entertainment complex. In Savannah, even industrial ruins eventually get a second act as a place to buy a $10 cocktail. From the promenade, you can watch the port's modern churn. massive container ships gliding silently toward the sea, passing under the soaring Talmadge Bridge with just enough clearance to avoid shearing off their antennas. Having absorbed enough nautical ambience to qualify for a mariner's license, we conducted a drive-by tour of our other favorite landmarks to stay dry. We squinted through the rain-streaked windshield at Forsyth Park's fountain and sped down the oak corridor of Bull Street. We also paid our respects to the Gen Library, a former department store converted by the Savannah College of Art and Design. According to local law, when the college first loaded the building with books, the sheer weight of accumulated knowledge caused the entire structure to settle into the soft coastal soil. An emergency renovation reportedly solved the problem, though how one convinces a building not to buckle under the gravity of human thought remains an engineering mystery. They have renovated it again since, presumably to correct for the added weight of e-books. Back at the rental house, my son and I made a final defiant trip to the beach. It was, once again, atmospheric, accompanied by a cold, insistent wind. We retreated indoors to watch Master and Commander, a film that felt like a fittingly dramatic conclusion to a day spent navigating the maritime history of a city that lives by the water. It was a fine tribute, especially since our own nautical adventure had involved little more than dodging puddles and protecting our gelato from the elements, a task that made the Gen Library's battle against its own contents seem almost trivial. That building will forever be, to me, the city's great intellectual Suffle. Echoes in the Spanish Moss, a Savannah Coda. Returning to a city you once called home is a peculiar form of time travel, one where you are both visitor and artifact. After 2 decades, stepping back into Savannah was less a vacation and more an archaeological dig into a former version of myself. I came armed not with a trowel and brush, but with a luxury car and a pair of names that had rattled around in my head since a summer traffic survey for the University of Georgia, Wormsloe and Pinpoint. Back then, they were just dots on a map, intriguing footnotes to a college job. Now, they were the anchors for a voyage back, a chance to measure the distance not just in miles, but in the geologic time of a man's life. The city greeted us with a damp, cold embrace that provided atmosphere where it withheld sunshine. Throughout our stay, the weather stubbornly refused to be picturesque, draping a curtain of wind and wet over everything. It whipped stinging sand against our legs on Tybee beach and dripped from the Spanish moss like a leaky faucet, amplifying the nostalgic mood. This was the perfect soundtrack for a drive down memory lane, a road paved with the ghosts of past selves. We drove by the old hospital where my wife and I launched our careers and the mall that once housed my short-lived, deeply misguided retail tenure. I had come to see how a city had weathered the years, but I was also here to confront the specter of the young man who once bought a giant crate of ramen noodles from a local Walmart, utterly convinced he had unlocked the secrets of personal finance. To understand Savannah is to see in layers, to perceive the sediment of countless forgotten lives beneath the grand public history of sieges and surrenders. My own history here is a collection of footnotes, most of them absurd. I drove us past my old apartment in a neighborhood I had charitably called the Ghetto. The building, once an architectural tragedy of peeling Spanish stucco called Alhambra, had been painted and given a name that sounded more like a software company. As we passed, I told my son about the Roaches, particularly the one that apparently mistook me for a space heater. I had woken one night to find him snuggled against my abdomen, a gesture of familiarity I was not prepared to reciprocate. I threw him against the wall so hard I think I gave him a concussion. I also described the day I looked up from the kitchen sink and noticed the faint outline of lettering on the wall. The previous tenant, clearly a philosopher, had affixed 3-inch construction paper letters to the drywall, and the maintenance crew had simply painted right over them. They read, "Do not eat the bugs." It was such a beautifully direct, profoundly troubling statement. Who posts that? A SCAD student, apparently, leaving behind a cryptic command for the culinarily desperate. Finding such a message doesn't make you feel enlightened. It just makes you question the structural integrity of the food chain in your own kitchen. My tour of personal monuments continued at the mall, where I found the exact spot my former employer, the Bombay Company, used to be. It is now a lingerie store, a transition that probably says something deep about the American economy. These quiet, personal recollections were set against the heavy sense of the city's official past. We stood in the sobering halls of the 8th Air Force Museum, a quiet space dedicated to the memory of 25,000 airmen who never returned from the skies over Germany. Outside sat a B-47 Stratojet, the same model involved in the 1958 Tybee Island mid-air collision, a local story where a lost hydrogen bomb became a footnote to the Cold War. We walked the grounds of Wormsloe, where descendants of one of Georgia's original colonial families still live on a sliver of the land granted to them before the country was even a country. The contrast was the story of the trip, the memory of a stunned roach in a cheap apartment set against the memory of a lost generation, the sight of a defunct furniture store set against a plantation that predates the nation itself. A city's identity, I realized, is a composite of its well-preserved past and the quiet, evolving stories of the people who just tried to get by within its grid. We had come with a list of historical sites, but it was in the unplanned moments where these layers bled into one another that the journey found its meaning. The past is never dead. It's not even past. William Faulkner. King tides and keen eyes, Savannah's serendipitous surprises. The second coordinate on my retrospective map was Pinpoint, a community settled by freed West African people after the Civil War and the birthplace of Clarence Thomas. But pilgrimages are often defined less by their execution than by their collapse. Our quest was promptly met with a flooded parking lot. King tides, a term that sounds majestic until it is keeping you from your destination, had swamped the access road. Nature, having already provided a grey, leaking sky, was now enforcing boundaries on the ground. Thwarted by the marsh, we rerouted to the University of Georgia's Aquarium on Skidaway Island, arriving just as the staff began their version of ringing the dinner bell. The tide's obstruction became an unexpected opening. We stood captivated by the triangular mouth of a remora, a creature that survives by attaching itself to larger marine animals like a needy aquatic couch surfer. My son watched, mesmerized, as it ate. We laughed at a shark that swam with the harmless energy of a golden retriever chasing its tail and studied the asymmetrical skull of a whale, wondering how it managed a straight line. It wasn't the deep historical dive into the Gula-Geechee corridor I had planned, but it was a first-rate lesson in weird fish biology. Eventually, the water receded enough for us to push east toward Tybee Island. The drive cuts across the marshes via Cockspur Island, passing the silent brick bulk of Fort Pulaski. This landscape has a history of ruining confident men's plans. In 1829, a young Robert E. Lee, fresh from West Point, spent his days here engineering drainage systems to stabilize the mud for the fort's foundation. Returning in 1861 as a Confederate general, he surveyed those same 7-foot-thick walls and declared them impregnable. He was wrong. Union forces on Tybee Island hauled rifled guns across the boggy terrain and, in April 1862, shattered the masonry in 30 hours. The fort stands today as a monument to the speed with which technology can render strategic assumptions obsolete. A heavy brick reminder that the ground is always shifting. On Tybee, we visited the Marine Science Center, where the legacy of defensive fortifications gave way to touch tanks. My son's blunt commentary became the lens through which I viewed the coast. He looked at the exhibits and wryly noted the suspicious ratio of turtles to fish, a kid-honest summary of the facility's crowd-pleasing strategy. I saw the place not just as a father revisiting his youth, but as a man watching his son form his own impressions of a world I thought I knew. This pattern of ambition giving way to reality continued at our rental. My goal for a serene, postcard-perfect beach walk was undone by a 5-hour bout of insomnia. I finally surrendered to sleep just as the sun rose, a personal failure of the highest order. Yet the moments the ocean granted me were stranger than any placid stroll. I saw a dolphin leap clean out of the water and, for one startling second, look directly at me. I witnessed one seagull body-check another with the ruthless efficiency of a hockey enforcer, a dispute presumably over a stolen French fry. These were not the moments I had scheduled, but they were the ones I received. Sharing the trip with my wife wove our histories together in ways I hadn't anticipated. We drove past the hospital where we both used to work, a silent nod to the life we started here before we had careers or 401ks. Back at the beach house, we united against a shared enemy, a determined invasion of tiny grass frogs. These creatures, the smallest amphibians in the United States, regarded our front door as a personal challenge, launching themselves inside every time it opened. It was a simple, ridiculous struggle that belonged only to this trip, a new story to set beside the old ones. The journey was never just about seeing Savannah again. It was about seeing myself through its lens. In sharing the shock of a dolphin's leap with my son, I was laying a new memory over the faint traces of the past. The ghosts of that younger man, the one who threw cockroaches against the wall of a humid apartment, were still here, but they weren't haunting me. They were just companions. Looking back at the mental image of those peeling walls and the painted-over warning not to eat the bugs, I saw not a squalid failure, but the precise, humorous measure of who I used to be, and how far we had both traveled. Maybe that's the real takeaway from Savannah. Every city is 3 places at once, the one you lived in, the one the history books recorded, and the one they sell you at the gift shop, and the trick is knowing which version you're standing in at any given moment. Of course, it helps if someone painted a warning on the wall, even if they've since covered it up. That wraps up our final chapter of this particular journey on the Rise the Limit. If you enjoyed the ride, the complete travelogue is available right now as a Kindle book on Amazon, Palmetto Bugs, and Broken Arrows. And if you want to come behind the scenes and get bonus content, you can join my community on Patreon. Thanks for listening.